Welcome back. Jose Otero here with Brian Altano and Per Schneider, and you are listening to a very special NVC focused on the Metroid series. And for this next portion of our conversation, I actually want to talk about the two Metroid oddities, the things that we didn't think would work where on the platform that they did, but for whatever reason, they both had strong qualities despite not really feeling like Metroid games for the most part. And one of them actually is very much a Metroid game. So Metroid Prime Pinball, which came out in October 2005 on the DS, and Metroid Prime Hunters, which was also on the DS, released in March 2006, but was a demo that came with your Nintendo DS, your FAT, P-H-A-T.
Yeah.
Fatty.
Yes. So let's talk about those two. You love Metroid Prime Pinball.
I do too.
Cool. I didn't think I would. It's so weird to look back at this era and go, man, we had like 7 Metroid games in just a few many years, and we haven't had one in ages now. Now I would even take a Metroid Prime Pinball too, because it just means someone at Nintendo is like, sure, Metroid something. Here you go.
It's weird how they forget once in a while. They're
Yeah.
like, yeah, okay, you guys love this stuff, but hold on a second.
And it was I actually I really liked Metroid Prime Pinball because it was perfect for the handheld format.
Yeah.
The shoulder buttons worked great as flippers, and I felt like I grew up playing a lot of video pinball games, and sometimes they would take characters we love and they would shoehorn them into a ball to try to make sense of it, like Sonic Spinball, Kirby, a Pokeball, Mario Pinball, which was awful, which didn't make any sense. And a lot of times it didn't make a lot of sense, but
This one made sense.
This one made sense.
When the DS
Yeah.
helped
Ball.
it, having
Yeah.
2 screens, right?
Yeah.
That really helped with the perspective.
It
Yeah,
made me
having-
want a real table, man.
I know,
Just
I know.
A real Metroid pinball table would have been so perfect.
And it was very clever. I mean, you got missiles and you fought bosses, and there was waves of enemies that you would fight, depending on different circumstances you would trigger. The music was really good. The art was great. Everything looked like it was built in the Metroid Prime universe, but also could have been built as a real pinball table, aside from animated characters walking across it.
Yeah, and
such.
then they could have probably faked that somehow, but like
Yes.
but then you had the DS with a 2-screen setup too, so you finally had a vertical table setup. Like it seemed like a marriage made in heaven.
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
2 screens and the Metroid franchise. I really liked that game. I felt like it didn't have as much content in it as I wanted in the end. I wish there were more tables and more things to do. But it's still it was a good game. It was a fun game. Fuse made it, right? They did a nice job.
Yeah, and then you had Metroid Prime Hunters, which, as mentioned,
like.
was so it gave you a lot to like though when it was a demo included with your
Sure.
Nintendo DS, because you were like, whoa, a Metroid! Like, look how well it transferred, right? Like, it had its own control scheme using the stylus. You were basically aiming on the bottom touchscreen. You were using the left bumper to fire, and you were handling movement with the D-pad. And it worked so well, and it looked really good. Developed by Nintendo Software Technologies, which is an American branch of the company. That they handle a couple of other games, but not many. Yeah, up in Redmond. And but oddly enough, when the game came out, when the final product was delivered, its multiplayer was amazing because you can link up with people locally and just play and do death matches and have some fun with that. But its single player was dreadful. It was awful. Like, it didn't feel right.
So something we didn't talk about before, I don't know how we missed over this, but a lot of the Metroid games, or I believe at least the original one, Zero Mission, I think Prime did this too. They end in this sequence where you need to escape and things explode. And Metroid Prime First Hunt, when it came to the original DS, the day the DS came out, it was strange and it was cumbersome and it was hard to play, but you got used to it. And you finished it and it said, coming soon. And I don't think it came for years.
Yeah, it didn't come for a year.
It did not come for a long time. And when it did, it was predominantly a multiplayer game, and they brought in all these new characters that they'd never done before. And the multiplayer was okay. I actually thought, I didn't think it was as great as you thought it was, but I thought it was just... It was hard
fun
to play that game for a long time.
Yeah, you get
but it was cool.
hand
Like, and it was a feat to see them pull something like that off on a handheld. But the single player,
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, just technical.
the single player
efficiency.
story-wise had one glaring flaw, and that was you went from planet to planet, collecting things, fighting enemies, beating a boss, and then doing that escape sequence where the planet would be shown exploding, and then you would return to that planet. which makes no damn sense at all.
0.21 gigawatts.
You blew it up, and then you come back, and it's there again. You're like, did everyone fix this?
Well, and the boss fights weren't memorable. Especially when you fought other bounty hunters. I mean, the AI was dreadful. They just ran around and shot at you.
So here's the thing. Like, if some people out there really liked it because of what it showcased on the 3DS, namely first-person shooter, multiplayer gameplay, right? I can totally understand that. What this game signified to me was, one, the DS is not a platform for first-person shooters.
Yeah.
I love the feeling of tactile shooting and jumping with buttons, and it made it impossible because you had to use the stylus or you had to use the stupid nub on your finger, which didn't feel quite right to me.
Sure. I would challenge that a little, though, and say maybe it just wasn't meant for, like, sort of high-action type shooters, because you had things like Dementium the Ward, you had games like Moon that were much slower paced and more deliberate with the action, whereas
I'm talking about FPS.
Yeah, specifically, like, trying to do, like, a high-action FPS just didn't feel right.
Look, Metroid Prime could have been done on the DS, technically it would have been a challenge, but the gameplay-wise, it would have worked. I feel like the faster FPS, it showed that this was not the platform to it. Two, it showed what would have happened if Metroid Prime had been an FPS and not a first-person adventure focus. And like the stuff I loved about Metroid Prime was all but absent from Hunters. And like I thought it was okay, but I thought it was utterly unremarkable. And if you removed Samus and the music from the game, it would be a run-of-the-mill
the music wasn't that
iguana. Shoot, it would be our Marines.
I mean, it was right back to the same problems Turok had, right? Like, jumping was hard in that game. You had to double tap this touch screen to jump, and then you had to put it back on and guide it around to look and shoot.
Activating missiles, too, were it was like a little button on
it was
the
a button in the
itself.
corner. It was very cumbersome. It was difficult because you really, they realized that you only had access to a few buttons once you had your finger. You basically had the trigger. That was it. That's all you could do. And it was interesting. I'm glad they tried it, but
yeah, me too.
First-person shooters on the DS were never a good idea because at some point in the lineage of video games, it became true that first-person shooters became synonymous with the best graphics that you can possibly produce at the time. Like, every first-person shooter game has always been and also a showcase for how great graphics can be. Like, if the new Call of Duty came out and it looked worse than last year's, you'd never hear the end of it, right? If Titanfall wasn't pushing everything that system could do, you'd never hear the end of it. So in some ways, first-person shooters were always doomed on the Nintendo DS, and I think they wanted to make them a thing there. And for some reason, they decided to use Metroid as their scapegoat for that, because Metroid had been closest to the precipice of becoming a first-person shooter, but it missed the point, and it missed the atmosphere that Prime had. It missed the platforming that Prime had. It missed the story that Prime had.
It just looked good. That was all it had.
It looked good, yeah.
And it is absolutely the product, and I don't mean this in a callous way, but it was the product of marketing in a way, right? Where it's like, you're looking at the market of video games out there, and every investor is talking about FPS. Every retailer is saying, we want FPS. Every kid wants to buy FPS, even though those kids were not supposed to play them yet. And like that genre was so big and becoming even bigger at the time that Nintendo probably looked around and said, crap, what can we do? Like what games can we get on our platform that actually tap into that
and they
market?
had the PSP to worry about, which was a much trumpeted, like, hey, this is going to be this slick piece of hardware that brings the console experience as an awesome portable. And remember when we had Mike Micah in, he actually talked a little bit about how marketing sort of brought about like a port of Gauntlet where they went all out. Was that story? Do you remember when he was here and he was talking about how their research showed that's what people wanted. They wanted action games. They wanted to show that their lineup was just as good as what PSP was going to do. And then when they completely overtook it, they were like, you know what? It's okay. We actually don't need it. We're going to pay for it anyway. Here you go. But we actually don't need this project anymore.
I still want to play that game.
Yeah, no, same here. Well, we know the guy who has it. So then transitioning there, let's talk about sort of the last two Metroids we got.
Corruption.
So we got Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, which was on the Wii. This was August 2007. This is actually a month before Halo 3. And I keep bringing up Halo because I feel like Metroid and Halo have accidentally been colliding in the fall, and whereas Halo has kind of been sort of leading leaps and bounds in terms of online and connectivity and game types and customization, Metroid has kind of still been in my mind, at least, a much better single-player game
of course,
than a multiplayer game.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy all the Halo games. I've played every main and side Reach and ODST
Exactly.
game. Like, I enjoy those games, but they never quite had the feeling of a working world. Like, the world is almost like a backdrop.
Yeah.
And in Metroid, the world is full of little things you can interact with, and it changes, and it's just sweet.
And it definitely points to the differences between those two games, where Metroid is a lot more adventure focused and Halo is not. And that's not a slam. Like, that's just the reality, at least to me, and I feel to you guys as well, unless you disagree. But we had our first Wii installment. The pointer and nunchuck method really worked well for Metroid.
Yeah, it did.
Surprisingly well.
And you could change the sensitivity too, so it actually, like, you could make it even more sensitive, and it worked
you needed
really
it
well.
more sensitive, because standard controls, it was just, you know, turn and just go read a magazine and come back, because you're still turning. Forever.
And again, this was sort of Nintendo saying, let's take Metroid and make it our first-person shooter. Like, let's shoehorn it into. I think everyone saw when the Wiimote and nunchuck were first unveiled, people saw the potential for that being just the new analog sticks, and the new mouse and keyboard almost. Yeah, like this is gonna be this will redefine first-person shooters. And again, the graphical parity that people expect with first-person shooters, just you couldn't really maintain on the Wii. And that's where great art direction comes in, and I think that's where retro really soars. You know,
and then, you know, Red Steel kicked things off in a negative light, right? Like, the concept of wielding a gun was great, but it didn't feel right. And the moment you wanted to turn 180 degrees, it didn't work. And
you
so
started shaking
Metroid
the gun
Prime
back and forth in front
and
of
some
the
other
screen.
games like Eurocom had a couple of shooters at the time too, where they just created a smaller box for the reticule to move into, and like when you got to the edge, it started to turn faster. They perfected it in 3, and Metroid Prime 3, it worked really well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you pointed out the art direction is kind of what saves this thing, because this game's unfortunate timing was that next gen had started. Right? Halo 3 and everything else that was on other platforms. And granted, we were always used to that with PC, but now it was consoles that
it was
were
right
also
there.
outpacing
Yeah, it was
them.
in the store right next to it.
Yeah, and but still, like, props to Retro Studios for amazing art direction. When you got to Skytown, you were just like, holy cow.
Oh, that's the one with all the rails going around,
yes,
right?
you were just like,
it looks
wow.
like
Looks so good.
Yeah.
But then you sort of had other things that didn't work right at all, like the human faces and the sort of anything that was trying to be photorealistic, like Take It Home. The purple bounty hunter girl, take her home.
Yeah.
She needed, like, really bad redesign.
But again, they did that thing where they started bringing extra characters into the story, which they didn't do with Prime 1 and 2 for the most part, you know, and it was all of a sudden you have you're on a ship with a bunch of space marines, and their helmets are opening up and they're talking to you, and it's
it was cool though to build out the universe. I didn't mind that. It just wasn't. It didn't look beautiful or impressive.
It didn't feel Metroid either. It felt a lot more action focused, and enemies took a lot of bullets to kill. The headshot was practically useless because it didn't really employ that. It was more about just fire and shoot and sort of do your thing. But it still had its cool ideas too. It had the ice missiles, which I thought was a really cool mechanic. I remember one part in the game where there's lava overflowing out of these pipes, and you have to freeze it with the missiles and then jump on it as platforms. Like, there's always the genius sort of like Zelda-ish ideas to it all.
Well, I love the welding. Like, I loved anytime you got to open a door by yanking it, and it actually worked, and the welding worked really well. I thought that interaction, like those moments of just kind of tinkering with the controls and having the time to focus on something, were really successful. There were others where it felt more like Surgeon Simulator, when you're trying to press the buttons in the ship and you're and it doesn't quite work. You know?
I do remember the grappling hook felt great when you nailed it. It was all contingent on that. Like, when you got that perfect motion down, it just felt awesome to whip your hand out, grab something, and pull it back in, and you feel the little rumble and everything like that. And that was outside of just the basic shooting mechanic, which I felt very, very natural, felt very good. But yeah, there was a few times where they would just be you'd be sitting there twisting both your arms in the air, being like, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah, totally true.
There was the fight with Ridley too. I love, in the tunnel where you're falling through.
Oh,
that tunnel.
yeah.
One of the coolest things I think they've ever done.
Yeah.
And the boss design, once again, memorable. Really good boss design, despite the fact that they were on hardware that was inferior, and it felt like it. I feel like, and we've talked about this before, if Metroid Prime made a return on Wii U, I think it could still stand toe to toe, only because with the right art direction, they don't look that underpowered. But regardless of what you did on Wii, you still ran into that wall. I feel.
Yeah.
You were
this franchise could really soar on the Wii U, and I hope we get another Prime. I thought the way they handled the first person is just awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And like I do think, even without pointer controls, using the visor as the screen on your display on your gamepad, and like using dual analog, I think it could be a really cool game.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you.